Hi, everyone, and welcome to Empowering the Opposition. My name is Lexi Wilson. I'm a licensed master social worker.
And my name is Dr. Nafis Alam, and our topic today will be alternative forms of justice. Lexi, you and I have been talking about alternatives to retributive justice and if they could actually be more effective than what we have here.
Yeah, justice is something that I'm really passionate about and something that I've got to learn, quite a bit about through the years, which is pretty funny because I never majored in criminal justice or anything like that. But it's something that's really interesting to me. And I was able to learn a little bit about it, going through school and social work. But actually where I learned the most about alternative forms of justice was when I studied abroad in South Africa. And I took this amazing class. And basically it was all about the state of South Africa post-apartheid and about how the country really, tried to come together and, administer justice. And we talked about different types of justice. So retributive is kind of in the traditional sense. It's the eye for an eye kind of justice, You kill my family, I kill you kind of thing. Like it's very just straightforward. You've made someone suffer, I make you suffer. And that's, sort of kind of what we've adopted here in the United States, right? Except we, instead of being so, barbaric with that kind of thing, we just lock people up. And why I think this is so important to understand is that we lock up more people in the United States than any other country in the entire world. We have 2.2 million adults in our prisons and jail systems. And if we look at like 100,000 U.S. citizens, 655 of those are behind bars.
Wow.
And many of which are there for substance use. So most of it, they're not violent. Most of them aren't violent offenders. Most of them are going to be, people who struggle with addictions, which we can get into that as well. But, there's a lot of trauma behind that, and it's kind of a whole nother issue. But, yeah, I think justice is something that is very interesting to learn about and to see how other cultures around the world administer justice and think of justice.
Well, the prison system in the United States is a booming business, and to make substance use, especially with substance, possession of substance with intent to sell, if we were to make that not a crime, then that particular business would struggle. And I think one of the primary reasons why this topic has been important to me is that, we have the business side, which is that, empowering the opposition. The opposing viewpoint to this is that since in the United States, the prison system is a business, should we veer more on the side of capitalism and making lower thresholds for incarceration so that more people can be incarcerated, therefore the business then grows? Or do we go to the argument that we've been making thus far here today, which is that we have the best interest of the individual in mind, rehabilitation, and not the business model of the prison system.
Yeah, and it really is a prison system. A lot of people don't know, but a lot of prisoners, especially, it varies state to state, but they'll have jobs, right? And they'll get paid pennies, and I'm talking pennies on the hour, in order to, kind of pass time. But yeah, pennies on the hour for, they'll work for farmers, they'll create furniture for the government, they'll, do so many different things. Really, it's like a well-oiled machine for the government. And then there's also arguments to be made about how, this has, there's arguments to be made about like the 13th Amendment and how it didn't necessarily abolish slavery, but it instead redirected it into the prison system. So that I think is a very important and crucial point to make here. One thing I think we can all agree on is the fact that our justice system is flawed. We were talking about this earlier about how whatever side you are in politics, I think most people would argue that there's definitely some room for improvement.
Yeah, prison reform is definitely, it's one of those things where people don't agree with
a lot.
The Democrats and the Republicans don't agree on anything, but it seems that prison reform is a point that everyone agrees on, that something needs to happen. Now, what that reform looks like, that is up for heated debate, obviously, but it's clear that
it's broken.
It's definitely broken.
It's broken, and that's why a lot of prisons and jails are actually looking at some of Norway's models for really looking at rehabilitation type of forms of justice, and they've found quite a bit of success with this. But speaking of Norway, they've been doing a really great job as far as like rehabilitating their inmates, trying new things, looking at different interventions as far as helping to really look at the individual. How can we help you? How can we restore this without necessarily losing that form of justice? And I think justice is a very important word here, because when we think of justice, it's just a human thing. When someone does wrong, and when I'm talking very, very wrong, we as humans, we want justice. We want people to understand what they did. We want them to, in some cases, suffer, right?
Yeah, pay the price, right?
To pay the price. And that's a very human thing. And that's kind of where these other forms of alternative forms of justice come in.
Yeah, I think, the American justice system, aside from being a business, is designed on vengeance. It's like, it is an eye for an eye, but unlike, the days of old, it's financially crippling in many ways.
Socially crippling, emotionally, really every type of crippling.
Yeah, for the most part, anyone who has ever been incarcerated is likely not to be able to get a decent job, for them, usually speaking.
Stigma attached to them will follow them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, even if it's like a white collar crime, it's always going to follow you around in that sense. So, we're of that mindset that it's like a one strike and you're out type of deal. Yeah. Where if you've ever been to prison, or if you've ever been to juvie, right? It's as though like for the rest of your life, that's who you are. It's like a tattoo, you can never get removed. But as we know, we've grown, I'm sure our listeners have grown over the course of the years. And it's kind of interesting that the prison system does not allow for growth without continued penalty. And, no matter how much better you've gotten, you're always made to, wear that tattoo on your shoulder. And, no matter how much better you've gotten, you're always reminded of your past because of jobs that you're not able to get, or loans, or, certain political things that you can't do. So you're always reminded of that. It's almost as though even after you've done your time after committing the crime, you're always going to have to pay the price, and you're never done doing your time. And therefore, I sometimes wonder if this is part of the business model, in that you release prisoners after they've, paid their dues and done what they had to do, but you make it so difficult for them to survive outside of the prison system that they end up committing crimes again in order to return to the prison system. It's a
revolving door. And we see that so often, especially with people with addictions, right? We very rarely are people given treatment that actually facilitates that inner healing, right? That trauma healing, the healing that really they need and able to conquer the addictions. And once they leave, they're not as prepared. And then it, kind of leads to that revolving door effect. Now, to introduce kind of some other forms of justice, one that we don't necessarily talk about, but which is becoming more popular recently, is called restorative justice. So a good example of this is when during the Rwandan genocide, after it had happened, there were, just in a state of brokenness, right? There were hundreds of thousands of people. Just the suffering, the mass deaths, and a huge need for justice, right? It's people can't just forget, the loss of loved ones, the atrocities that had occurred. There was a desperate and dire need for justice. And so after, the genocide had ended, what they had done, instead of locking up these hundreds of thousands of people, they did something different with limited resources, but that proved to be fairly effective if you ask most people. Not entirely, but fairly. And it's called the Gacha Tribunals. And basically what they did as far as like restorative justice was they allowed people to plead guilty, apologize, shorten the jail time, and work on community service. Now the key here is community, okay? They didn't ostracize the individual, but they really highlighted the individual and brought the community together as a whole, and incorporated things such as restorative justice circles. So this is a pretty foreign concept to a lot of people, but it's actually being used a lot more now. So what a restorative justice circle is, let's say somebody murdered someone else, okay? So what they would do in that community is they would have the perpetrator and they'd have the victim, and they would be in the middle of the circle. And then you'd have all the people on the outside of the circle, and that's going to be the community members, family members, elders, all the different people in the community. And so the perpetrators and the perpetrator would have to work it out, with the victim, confess, make amends, sometimes offer payment, offer service, and it was worked out as a whole within that community. And it proved to be very cost effective, and fairly effective as far as justice goes, at keeping communities together, really cultivating forgiveness and growth of the perpetrator, and really giving that victim the recognition of, hey, you were done wrong, we're going to work this out together.
Well, I mean, that may be effective, but in empowering the opposition, I wonder to myself if the community comes up with a restoration plan, I suppose, that the victims of that crime feel are insufficient, then what?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think there's pros and cons to this type of justice, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah.
You have issues like, okay, maybe something like this was worked out, community service, all those kind of things. But at the same time, how does the victim truly feel, right? Maybe they were felt pressure from the community and their family members to forgive, and that kind of stuff's not easy to forgive. And so there definitely could be the underside of not feeling like justice was really administered, right?
Yeah, because imagine if the leader of a particular community that employs restorative justice, their son, let's say, were to commit a crime, and let's assume that there's a victim to that crime. It's not a victimless crime. And then the victim of that crime is now pressured to forgive and forget because of the power that the
group holds.
The group holds, and the parent of that child, that perpetrator holds. So you can use political influence to gain lesser sentences for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there is, not saying that any form of justice is perfect, but when we're empowering the opposition, we have
to think of the other sides to it. Yeah, I think that's so important, because that's a lot of pressure as a victim. You're there with your perpetrator, which obviously that's traumatic enough, and then you have the pressure of the elders in the community and highly recognized people in your family to do something, and to forgive. And if in an ideal world, and if everyone felt comfortable, I think this is the most, one of the most incredible forms of justice in an ideal world where people are ready. But if people aren't ready, and the crime is just absolutely horrific, you can't necessarily blame someone for not forgiving or feeling pressured into making a decision, to not forgive, I guess.
Yeah, and in restorative forms of justice, it appears as though that precedence is not primary focus, which means that
Exactly.
two different people can commit the same crime and get two different sentences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how fair is that?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's also that element to it as well. But what's also interesting too is that I took a school of social work class my last semester of the social work program, and what was interesting was I was shocked to hear that the Boise School District is actually incorporating restorative justice circles into their justice system, which I thought was fascinating. I hadn't heard that term since I was in South Africa, and she said that it was highly effective with kiddos, and I can actually see how, because it's obviously going to be a lot less serious crimes, right? But it really helps demonstrate different things to the group, right? It helps to recognize and maybe empathize with the victim. And yeah, there was a lot of benefits to it. And I thought it was pretty actually brilliant to incorporate into a school setting and maybe more beneficial. Sometimes those who are acting out in school settings are the ones who need some compassion and from the whole, more than anyone.
Yeah, and in restorative justice, the person who, I guess, commits the crime has a lot more say in what the punishment would be. So they feel like they have a lot more ownership of the restoration plan, I guess you could say. So it's not like they're being mandated, but they've bought into the idea of doing that particular community service. It's almost as though they have agreed to that plan as opposed to a plan being agreed on their behalf. Right.
Yeah, and I think it's more of a holistic thing, so not necessarily that the perpetrator comes up with their sentence. I think it's more of like the group and the victim are the ones who kind of help to agree on it. But yeah, I'm curious if there is a say for the perpetrator, and I bet there is to some extent, that collective conversation of what is fair, right? And obviously restorative justice circles, you throw in some of the people who've committed some of the hardest crimes in the United States, probably not going to work, right? But I just think it's interesting to think about how we've gotten so locked into this one way of justice, this one form of justice, and just really how ineffective it is. Really, the entire goal of retributive justice is, you suffer, I suffer, whereas restorative, the goal is, okay, how do we cultivate healing, forgiveness? There's just two entirely different aims. And I'm just curious, what's best for the whole. And there's totally pros and cons for both.
Well, I think, it's important to understand that once you've hit a certain threshold, restorative justice simply wouldn't work for rape or murder or something like that. We're not talking about restorative justice for.
Well, they actually used the restorative justice circles for rape and murder in South Africa and in Rwanda. I don't know how well that would be implemented here in the U.S., but they used that there, and it worked there probably because of the limited resources and stuff like that. It was used for very serious offenses, but yeah, here I don't think it would it would fly.
Yeah, it would not fly, but we'd also understand that one of the reasons it wouldn't fly is because of the business nature of the prison system.
Yeah.
And that's not going anywhere. So, when we, not you and I obviously, but when we, the general public, consider how to go about with prison reform, we have to acknowledge that the businessmen and businesswomen of prisons, they're not going to want to give up their capital and their assets.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to negotiate prison reform while still remaining in the parameters that they'll likely set for us, as opposed to the other way around.
But isn't that just crazy just to think about the fact that we're discussing human capital, okay? That's the same way people discuss slavery, human capital.
Yeah.
Why are we even talking about human capital? The fact we have to talk about that is pretty ridiculous in itself. If our entire aim, as I'm using air quotes, but you can't see me, is to, rehabilitate and this and that. We shouldn't we shouldn't have to say human capital, but the fact is there are people getting extremely rich off of this. And a lot of people don't know there's private prisons. Like, yeah, there are state-run prisons, but there are also privately run prisons.
Yeah. It's a booming business. I mean, you and I should start our own prison. I mean, we'd be making money hand over fist.
I couldn't live with myself for the rest of my life. There are private prisons, and states will send off their inmates to these private prisons when they overflow their own prisons. And so you have literally prisons that are companies, basically trying to incentivize other states to send their inmates there, which is pretty crazy.
It's very similar to military contracting, where private organizations take on a lot of military contracts to develop weapons and even do some of the work that they need to do. You know, so a lot of ex-military members will sometimes go into private contract businesses and use their skills there. So it's similar in that sense, but
I think the key difference there is the incentive, right? The incentive to hold beds.
Yeah.
Like, there's an incentive to keep prisoners in prison.
But don't you see that in social work, inpatient hospitals and agencies as well? Isn't that there's an incentive to keep the census up?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an incentive to keep people there, right? But at the same time, they're not asking for patients to they're asking for hospitals to send me your patients, right? But they're not reaching out to people and asking them to be suicidal and come to my inpatient facility. I think it's a little different.
Well, they're not going out into the community and asking for it, but I do know for a fact that there are plenty of inpatient organizations that will fudge their assessments to make it appear as though a client or a consumer is presenting behaviors that they aren't, just so they can stay. Yeah, of course. Listen, anything that's privatized can be weaponized. Yeah. Right? So,
yeah. I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
So I've never worked in an inpatient psych unit, but I did work at a hospital ER doing social work for my internship. So we would send patients there, but I never actually got to see, what happened, once they were there. But absolutely, there's definitely issues with the privatization of that. I just think there's very specific, but see, there's the interesting thing though too, because we deinstitutionalized mental health care, right? So we kind of, for the most part, took the state out of it. Yeah, we still have state hospitals, but now largely a lot of people who are mentally ill are either going to the inpatient private facilities or they're going to prisons.
Well, I feel like if the answer of what's better existed, we would have had it by now,
Well, I think ideally nonprofit, but at the same time, they're making money.
Yeah, I mean, nonprofits...
Hospitals are nonprofit.
I know. Hospitals are nonprofits, but for-profits tend often to be at the cutting edge of efficiency and effectiveness, not nonprofits.
Yeah.
So,
because they have more resources.
And they're more business-oriented, and they see everything through the lens of dollars saved and dollars earned, which means that everything that a nonprofit does, a for-profit will try to do better and cheaper. And many times they are successful. So a nonprofit generally will not be as efficient as a for-profit, but then a for-profit makes no qualms about, does not pretend to be about anything but the money. So you're stuck in between, it's a catch-22 because for-profits can be more effective and more efficient, but those profits would be going to that particular organization. Whereas a nonprofit may be less efficient and less effective, which means the community is, underserved. But whatever the nonprofit makes goes right back into the community. So what is it that we want? The answer, the question of what's better or what's, one of my old professors said, I think when I was graduating with my master's, just remember, that the answer to every question is it
depends.
That's it. It's as simple as that. Yeah. Done. Like, you can win every argument with that and just leave it alone.
Yeah.
So,
we want easy answers, and ideally certain things sound, really great, but not in all circumstances do they work, or will they work.
Yeah, it's true. It really depends on the circumstances. It depends on the person or the people or the community even. It depends on the victims of particular crimes, whether or not they'd be willing to accept that particular style of punishment. And it's never going to be an easy answer. All we know is that what we have right now is not working. And, everyone from the left side of politics to the right side of politics agrees that it is not working. Yet nobody, including us, we're not coming up with solutions as to how we can make it work best. I think that's part of the problem, is that too many people are afraid to throw their names into the hat because they can't figure out the perfect way to run the prison system. Once people start understanding that there is no perfect way to run the prison system, rather, what is the best practice way? As in, we're going to lose some. We're not going to be the best that we're not going to be perfect, but we're going to be the best that we can be. If we were to acknowledge that approach, I think there could be some really great ideas for prison reform. But because of the business element, because of how much of a moneymaker it is, because of just like the social stigma. Also because everyone agrees that prison reform is necessary. That also means that there's no disagreements on prison reform, which means there's no conflict on prison reform or the need for prison reform, thereby making it less likely to be reformed. When everybody agrees that this is not a good thing, people are essentially agreeing that there's nothing that we can do about it, when in fact there probably is.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do about it. One idea I've always thought of is, what if there was like a separation between obviously violent offenders and, people who commit heinous crimes, and then you have the substance users. Why do we mix them all together? Like, that's a real question I have. I mean, you'd think that there would be almost like different tracks, because you're dealing with two very different things.
Well, there could be some overlap.
Definitely overlap. But I mean, a lot of people have been locked up for marijuana in the past, with no history of violent crime, and some of them are still in prison right now. And so it's like, okay, well, it's just interesting how not only do the times change, but we also see this, just not willingness to kind of think about things in a unique and different way.
I mean, this is how you know that the business side of prison rules the day, is that the moment that marijuana is legalized, all of the people that are still serving time for marijuana possession will still be in jail. They're not going to be released, which is as unfair, in my opinion, as you can get.
Anything else. Yeah. As unfair as you can get.
Yeah.
But I wonder if they could do like a mass pardon.
Well, here's the empowering the opposition part, right? In that when you committed the crime, it was illegal. Therefore, you should serve the time, even if the time goes beyond the time at which your prior activity would then be legalized. So there's the empowering the opposition argument there. And there's validity to that, because if there wasn't validity to it, then anyone can commit a crime today and say, well, it's not going to be a crime tomorrow.
But then also what is law, right? Not all law is just. Not all law is right. We're humans. We decide what is law. And what is legal now, or what, for example, 40, 50 years ago in Idaho, I could never marry someone who's African American. Just wouldn't happen. It was illegal, right? Is that just? No. Was that part of the law? Yeah. Like, it's just, that's the thing with the law too, is like, maybe it was illegal then, but we have a much better understanding of why should be legal now.
Yeah. And I agree with you there. And, it's just, we just have to understand like what the opposing arguments would be. And I guess that would be it.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, it's we definitely don't have answers. I'm happy that, people are starting to ask the questions. What I don't want to do is stop asking these questions and just accept that this is an imperfect prison system. We know that it's imperfect, but let's try and make it better.
Yeah. How do we make it better? We need to continue asking these questions and being aware and doing our research and, understanding.
If we're really empowering the opposition, maybe this is the best that we can do. Maybe, retributive justice and, the prison system, the way that we have it right now, despite all of its flaws, maybe it's the best that we can do. And maybe that's why no one has taken it upon themselves to restructure it and redesign it in such a way that works as best as possible. Maybe they've done assessments. People smarter than us have done assessments and have realized that this is the best that we can do. So it remains, maybe.
Yeah. And, in a counterpoint to that too, maybe we know it's the best business people can do. We know this is like the gold mine of, the best that those who have deep pockets can do. We know that.
Yeah.
But what we don't know is, actually we do know that this isn't, this is not what is best for, the majority of, people who are trying to get rehabilitated. We know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anytime I try to look at a topic or a very difficult situation, I always try to think about who has the power. Like in almost any controversial situation, I will always look at what party has power and what are they trying to do with the party that does not have the power. So that's just anytime I'm ever considering a topic, I always just try to think of those like benefits.
So it's like the dominant groups imposing upon the subordinate groups, and what is it that they're trying to get the subordinate groups to do? What
are they gaining from it? Why? And you can see a lot just by looking at the justice system, how that affects those who, are oppressed and, haven't had, a fair shot at life or, have made some small minor drug, offenses or whatever it may be. I guess that's the other thing I'd want to add.
Yeah, and the subordinate groups in some instances do get plenty from the dominant groups. In many ways, their survival is dependent on the dominant groups too. So sometimes the interplay between the two sets of, the two groups can be something that is healthy. But in many times, of course, any group that is dominant has the propensity to get drunk on power.
Yeah. And that's so enticing and inviting. Also, something I would want to mention is some things that, prisons and jails are working towards doing right. Like, I know that there's prisons out there that have like those animal, like rehabilitation kind of, what are they called? They're like it's like an animal training program essentially. And this is one thing that I think is awesome. So a certain, for the inmates who are in prison, basically the shelter will take dogs who, have behavioral issues and stuff like that. And they'll take them and certain inmates who have good behavior and stuff like that, they will allow them to like keep the dog. The dog will be in their cell for like 24 hours a day. And they'll work to train that dog and to really help kind of cut down on those behavioral problems. So that's really great. There's group therapy that is implemented. A lot of prisoners also have access to like mental health care. There's groups that are run at prison. So I think, overall, certain prisons and jails are more trying to go towards this Norway model of really rehabilitation and restoration. Not all jails and prisons aren't getting it right. Like, that's one thing I want to be clear, because there are strides being made, absolutely. But I think it's good to look at, all of those sides of the table there.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'm Dr. Nafis Alam.
And I'm Lexi Wilson, a licensed master social worker. This has been Empowering the Opposition. See you next time.